Welcome aboard the Evolution Eisenbahn, the train of life, where we go on guided tours through the tree of life to learn about biology and evolution. I am Sebastian and I'm your tour guide. Today is our very first tour and I hope you're as excited as I am. We will travel to the bacteria. And by the end of it, you will have gained an overview of what types of bacteria you can find on this planet, and you will have learned about some of their craziest abilities and most interesting attributes. But before we depart, I want to say a few words about this train station we're at right now. It's called Luca Station. Do you know Luca? Luca is a special someone. Luca is your ancestor and mine and everyone else's. In fact, Luca is the ancestor of all life. Luca is the origin of life, the seed from which the tree of life grew. And that is the reason that we will start each of our tours here and why this station is called Luca Station. Luca stands for Last Universal Common Ancestor. You know, there might have been living beings before Luca and alongside Luca, but only Luca is the last universal common ancestor. All the others, if they existed, have died out and left no descendants. Only Luca's descendants made it. Yeah, and that's us. We're all Luca's children. And with we, I mean all life forms. So that is from bacteria to carrots to you. Okay, but what exactly did Luca look like? You know, what was it? Well, to be honest, we cannot do much more than guess, because it was so long ago. Luca was in all likelihood much simpler than a bacterium, maybe not much more than a molecule in the primordial soup. You know, some primitive precursor of DNA maybe. A primordial soup is a cocktail of chemicals, the building blocks of life, and we believe that life came from such a primordial soup. And this is where Luca originated, and this is where life and evolution got started. Okay, and now the journey can begin. Let's go! The bacteria are one of the three so-called domains of life. At the most basic level, you can sort all living things into three domains. The other two are the archaea and the eukaryota, and we will get to know those soon on the future tours. But the bacteria may be the oldest domain. That means they're closest to the earliest life forms and Luca. But being the closest does not mean that they're close. Don't forget, the bacteria underwent just as much evolution as any other life form that is alive today, including humans. So they had a lot of time to evolve and to change and get more complex. And so the bacteria alive today probably look nothing like Luca anymore. To be honest, it's pretty unfair to give the bacteria only one train station on this map. I mean, they have more than 120,000 different species, and that's just the ones that we know of. But, you know, we needed the space for all the different plants and animals, so I hope the bacteria fans out there, and I'm one of them, will forgive me. Next stop, bacteria. And here we are, the bacteria. As I said, there is a lot of them, so to get an idea of their diversity, we have to group them somehow. One possibility would be to group them according to their classification. So here you see some of their phyla. A phylum is kind of like a supergroup of the bacteria, right? And here you only see some of them. But, you know, unless you're already an expert, that's probably not very useful to you. So let's try group them by something else. You can also group bacteria by their shape. Very common is, for example, this coccus form. Coccus means grape in ancient Greek, so it's, you know, it's a sphere. Or the bacillus form, which means rod, so it's rod-shaped, and, you know, all the combinations thereof. For example, a streptococcus is, you know, a chain of coccus forms. Strepto means chain, and there's also specialized forms like corkscrews. And yeah, there's many more forms than depicted here, but those are the most common. Or we can group them by their flagella type. Flagella is what the bacteria use to move around. And if they have no flagella at all, it's called atrichous. Trichous means hair, so they have no hair. If they have one flagellum, it's called monotrichous, or if they have several, it's polytrichous. Or there can also be peritrichous. Peri means around, and then they have flagella in all directions. And my last suggestion would be to group them by what they eat, by their sources of energy. Some bacteria eat organic compounds like fats and proteins and sugars. So I put a little sugar cube. Those are their organotrophs. They eat organic matter, just like us. But some bacteria can also live off inorganic compounds. Then they're called lithotrophs, which literally means stone eaters, because they can live off stuff like sulfur and iron and salts. And then thirdly, there is the bacteria who can get energy from sunlight, just like plants. They're called phototrophs, light eaters. All right, now that we can categorize bacteria, let's look at some interesting species. For example, Clostridium botulinum of the phylum Firmicutes, strong skin bacteria because they have a cell wall. They are organotrophs and they have the following attributes. They produce the most poisonous substance known. Just 70 nanograms can kill you. A nanogram is a billionth of a gram. And incidentally, it is also the most expensive substance known at about $100 trillion per kilo. And it's used to paralyze muscles, for example, to alleviate wrinkles. Clostridium tetani, very hard to kill. They produce spores that can survive at 150 degrees Celsius for hours. And if you get these spores in an open wound, for example, you can get tetanus or lockjaw, which leads to muscle cramps. And some people have it so bad that they even fractured their spine. Thankfully, there's a vaccine. Bacillus subtilis, honestly a pretty boring standard bacterium. It's everywhere, in your gut, in the soil, but I included it anyway because it's very well studied. And by the way, what you see there at the bottom, that is just some extra info for the experts out there. So this bacterium likes oxygen and is gram-positive. Bacteria can either be gram-positive or gram-negative. It just has some indication of the composition of their cell wall. And this bacterium is the most well-known gram-positive one. Staphylococcus aureus. You've probably heard of that one as a bad guy, but it's mostly harmless. Everyone has staphylococci on their skin. It's just that this particular species sometimes causes problems. Especially when you're already sick, it can take advantage and infect you. And there's this famous strand called MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which is even resistant to methicillin. And methicillin is one of these last resort antibiotics. So if it's even resistant to that, that means that if it does cause problems, it's really hard to treat. Lactobacillus, any species. Little trick you can use if you don't want any particular species, but just any, you put SP for species. Because there's many Lactobacillus species which are all very similar, so it doesn't really matter which one here. But among all bacteria, Lactobacillus is probably our best friend. It promotes a healthy skin, it promotes a healthy gut, and what's more, Lactobacillus also helps with the production of some of our favorite food items that require fermentation. So, for example, it helps with making cheese, yogurt, wine, certain beers, kimchi, pickles, cider, cocoa, that's right, no chocolate without Lactobacillus, and last, but certainly not least, sauerkraut. Listeria monocytogenes. Those are the reason why you should wash your vegetables, otherwise they might infect you. On the upside though, if they do infect you, it's really cool. Get this, even though they usually move around with lots of flagella, when they're in your cell, they ditch the flagella and develop rocket propulsion. They force the proteins in your cell to kind of condensate behind them, and that's pushing them forward. For the experts, that's actin polymerization. And that way they zip around in your cells like little comets. And this is also how they shoot into the next cell. Amazing. Anabaena of the phylum Cyanobacteria, blue-green bacteria. Also still sometimes called blue-green algae, even though of course they're not algae, but initially we thought they were, because just like plants, they do photosynthesis. Anabaena sometimes kills cattle, because if they infect the drinking water, they can produce a neurotoxin. And what's also interesting about them is that they can produce their own fertilizer. They have specialized cells called heterocysts, which literally means different cells, that do not make photosynthesis, but instead they fix nitrogen. That means they can use nitrogen from the air and make it into nitrogen compounds. And that's pretty much what fertilizer is. It's an interesting example of differentiation where even though all the bacteria have the same genes, they take on different jobs, which of course is very common in animals, but it also happens in bacteria. Gliomargarida. This cyanobacterium seems pretty ordinary, but it is truly remarkable for the simple fact that it's the closest living relative of the chloroplasts. Yes, those chloroplasts, the chloroplasts that make plants green and make it possible for them to do photosynthesis. Some ancient ancestor of Gliomargarida formed a symbiotic relationship with a eukaryote, and thus the plant was invented. I will tell you the whole story on a future tour when we explore the plants. Bacteroides, of the phylum Bacteroidetes, rod-like bacteria, which is pretty redundant because bacteria already means small rod. So I guess they are the most bacteria-like bacteria. And that's also kind of fitting because they are everywhere. And for example, they outnumber all other bacteria in your gut. So I guess they are the bacteria we have most contact with. Deinococcus radiodurans, of the phylum Deinococcus thermus, a phylum that's just named after its two most prominent members. This bacterium is in the Guinness Book of World Records as the world's toughest bacterium. It can withstand radiation, cold, dehydration, acid, and vacuum. And not surprisingly, it can survive and lives pretty much everywhere, from your gut to some rocks in Antarctica to nuclear reactors. Thankfully, it's harmless to humans. Thermus aquaticus, the other prominent member of the phylum Deinococcus thermus. This bacterium thrives at extreme heat. It was famously discovered in a hot spring at Yellowstone National Park, and it is the key to PCR, polymerase chain reaction. For that, you need a polymerase to amplify DNA, but the polymerases, for example, in your body, they only work at body temperature, right? But for PCR, you need higher temperatures. And that's exactly where the polymerase of Thermus aquaticus works best. So they made modern PCR possible, which is still one of the most important diagnostic tools we have today. Treponema pallidum, of the phylum Spirochetes, spiral bacteria, because they look like spirals. And this bacterium causes the human disease syphilis. Thankfully, nowadays there's good treatment for it. Borrelia. This bacterium causes Lyme disease and is mostly transmitted by ticks. If you develop a rash around a tick bite that looks like a bullseye, it's definitely Lyme disease. But it doesn't always develop, so be careful with tick bites. Acidithiobacillus, of the phylum Proteobacteria, which I decided to translate as polymorph bacteria, because the members of this phylum are very diverse and have all kinds of different shapes and also lifestyles. So for example, this one here is our first example of a lithotroph, a bacterium that can thrive on inorganic compounds. This one eats iron oxide, aka rust, and it can also eat sulfur. In that case, it then produces sulfuric acid. Salmonella. These bacteria often occur on chickens, and that's the reason why you should always chill raw chicken and eggs, because otherwise they can grow exponentially and make you sick. Vibrio fischeri. These guys can create bioluminescence, so they can produce light. They live in the ocean, and there they have a very good friend, the Hawaiian bobtail squid. These squids have specialized light organs which are designed to be the perfect habitat for Vibrio fischeri. So the bacteria live in them, and then these squid can glow in the dark, and they actually use this for camouflage, because in the ocean, nothing gives you away like your shadow. But if you glow, you have less of a shadow. And that's why Vibrio fischeri and the squid are best friends. Vibrio cholerae. They do not glow, but they also live in water. And if you drink water that's contaminated with them, you get cholera. Not a problem anymore where there's modern sanitation, but if in doubt, boil your water and you'll be fine. Yersinia pestis. This bacterium is a real killer. It's the cause of the bubonic plague, and in the Middle Ages killed pretty much half of Europe in the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. It's transmitted by the rat flea, and it still exists today, but it can be treated with antibiotics, so it's usually not a problem. Escherichia coli, or probably better known as E. coli. E. coli is the bacterium. You definitely heard of it. We've been studying it for decades. It grows very easy in the lab, it reproduces every 20 minutes, and pretty much all things we know about bacteria we have learned from E. coli, especially how they work on the molecular level. Otherwise, E. coli is a pretty standard bacterium, mostly harmless, and it lives in your gut. And there it produces vitamin K, so it even does you some good. Helicobacter pylori. These bacteria are the most common cause of stomach ulcers. So they do like to live in your stomach, but they don't like the stomach acid. So they burrow into the mucous membrane, the protective lining of your stomach, that is actually there to protect your stomach cells from the acid too. So by making a hole in it, the stomach acid attacks your stomach cells. And that's actually causing the ulcer, but these guys are definitely to blame. And well, they kind of look like screws, and I believe that helps them burrowing into the stomach lining, but I think that's not proven yet. Pseudomonas fluorescens. You find many Pseudomonas species in the lab. They're often studied, but they're mostly pretty standard bacteria, not that exciting. But Pseudomonas fluoresces. So that means in UV light, it glows blue. And that makes it just a little bit more special. Rhizobium leguminosarum. These bacteria live in a symbiotic relationship with legumes. So that is plants like beans and peas. They live in specialized root nodules where they fix nitrogen. So that is, they can take nitrogen from the air and make it into nitrogen compounds. That is, fertilizer that can be used by the plants. And in exchange, they get fed by the plants. And so they are the reason that legumes can grow on pretty poor soil. Agrobacterium tumefaciens. These bacteria also live on plants, but they don't do them any good. In fact, they inject certain genes into the plant cells, forcing them to grow a tumor that then feeds the bacteria, and they don't give the plant anything in return. But because they can do this, because they can insert genes into plants, this bacterium has also been useful for genetic engineering of plants. Neisseria gonorrhoeae. This bacterium is the cause of gonorrhea, also known as the clap. It can be treated with antibiotics, but it's a bit worrisome that there's more and more resistant strains. Neisseria meningitis. The main cause of bacterial meningitis, a serious disease where there's an inflammation of the lining of your brain. 10% of patients die, and that is with treatment. Thankfully, there's a vaccine against them. Chromadium. These guys are phototrophs. That means they produce their own food with the help of sunlight energy, like plants. Although not really like plants, because plants use CO2 and water to make sugar, and that is their food. But Chromadium, they use H2S, that is hydrogen sulfide, a very stinky gas that smells like rotten eggs. So they use that and with the light energy transform it into sulfur, elemental sulfur. And then they store that in their cells, and that is what they eat. Chlorobium, of the phylum Chlorobi, green sulfur bacteria. These guys are very similar to the previous Chromadium, which belong to the so-called purple sulfur bacteria. So if there are sulfur compounds and light, these two often occur together. But since Chlorobium are green, it's very easy to mistake them for algae, but of course they're not. They cannot tolerate oxygen at all, and they eat sulfur compounds, something that algae cannot do. Thermotoga, of the phylum Thermotogae, the hot toga bacteria, so called because they're kind of wearing a toga and they like it hot. Extremely hot, in fact. They live in almost boiling water, and we think they can only do that because they stole some genes from archaea. Archaea are another domain of life. We will get to know them in our next tour very well. But the archaea are famous for being able to live in extreme environments, and we think the Thermotoga stole that ability from them. And another fun fact, Thermotoga can produce hydrogen gas. Equifax pyrophilus, of the phylum Equificota, water maker bacteria, because they make water. Maybe you've heard the expression that water is pretty much burnt hydrogen. So you take hydrogen and oxygen and make it into H2O. And they do that in a controlled reaction, and this is how they get energy. So they quite literally make water. And they do that near underwater volcanoes at water temperatures of about 90 degrees Celsius. So they also probably stole some genes from the archaea to do that. Chloroflexus, of the phylum Chloroflexi, green flexible bacteria, because they're just so darn flexible. They can do photosynthesis and live off sunlight, but if you keep them in the dark, they'll just start eating organic compounds. There's oxygen, great. There's no oxygen, also no problem. They're just so darn flexible. Chlamydia trachomatis of the phylum Chlamydiae, cloak bacteria. These bacteria are a little bit like viruses. First of all, they're much smaller than most bacteria, and second of all, they have to be parasites. They can only reproduce with the help of animal cells. So if they're in your cell, they hide in a cloak and force the cell to help them reproduce, and then the cell ruptures open and more cells are infected. And if you are infected, you quite literally have chlamydia. Streptomyces of the phylum Actinobacteria, ray bacteria. I think they're called that because they form these root-like rays, I guess. And they have long been mistaken for funguses, but now we know they are in fact bacteria. And they are actually among our best friends in the bacteria domain, because, for example, they produce a compound called geosmin, which makes forest soil smell like forest soil. This like earthy aroma of mold and decay, but in a good way. And what's more, they're also huge traders to their domain, because most of the antibiotics we have, at least of those that are of natural origin, are actually derived from Streptomyces species. So they also saved countless lives. Brocadia anamoxidans of the phylum Planktomycetes, plankton bacteria, because the first members of this group were discovered in the ocean's plankton, but they actually occur pretty much everywhere. But Brocadia anamoxidans was the first organism discovered that is capable of the so-called anamox reaction, which is extremely important for the planet because it reverses nitrogen fixation. Some bacteria, they pull nitrogen out of the air, make it into nitrogen compounds, and anamox reverses that and releases nitrogen. So this way you get the global nitrogen cycle. In fact, it has been estimated that half of all the nitrogen in the air is produced by the anamox reaction. And since, the atmosphere is mostly nitrogen, you can say that Brocadia and friends produce half of the entire planet's atmosphere. And what's more, Brocadia anamoxidans in particular is the only organism known capable to produce hydrazine. Hydrazine is rocket fuel. For example, the James Webb Space Telescope uses hydrazine in its thrusters to maneuver. Unfortunately, we cannot extract hydrazine from these bacteria, but maybe we can learn some tricks from them how to produce hydrazine more efficiently in the future. And that was the last one. Of course, there are many, many more bacteria that I did not talk about today, and probably even more that we haven't even discovered yet, but I hope you got some idea of the diversity of the bacteria. There's so many different ones, right? And they have so many crazy abilities and attributes. And yeah, some are really, really good for us, some are really bad for us, some are kind of neutral, some are of utmost importance for the global ecosystem. So, right, even though bacteria might be tiny and mostly invisible to us, their importance cannot be overstated. And don't forget, bacteria are Luca's children just like us. They are our cousins that we share this planet with. And with that, we have reached the end of today's tour. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comment section. I will answer as many as I can. Join us next time on another tour on the train of life. Thank you for choosing Evolution Eisenbahn. Take care and goodbye.